Today's lecture will be finishing up the sections on emotions, and in particular, we'll begin with our discussion on motivation. This is from Pettijohn, chapter 8. So, the book defines motivation as a process that initiates, guides, and maintains goal oriented behaviors. What this basically means is motivation is why people do what they do, what's kind of motivating us, what's pushing us to perform certain behaviors. For instance, listening to this lecture or attending a class in Psych 102, there could be multiple motivating forces behind that. It could be more internal, such as a desire for learning, gaining knowledge, wanting to come to class, or it could be more of an external motivator, such as needing to get an A, needing to perform well to keep a scholarship, to maybe keep funds coming in, that kind of stuff. So we'll talk more about internal and external sources of motivation as well as other sources such as self-efficacy and that kind of thing throughout today's lecture. But in a nutshell, it's why people do what they do. And there are many, many different motivators. So one of the biggest theorists when we discuss motivation is going to be Abraham Maslow. And he was a humanistic psychologist. So if you can remember back, I'm sure it was discussed a bit in Psych 102. Humanistic psychologists tend to kind of work from a perspective of growth, of human potential, wanting to help a client through psychotherapy to reach their greatest potential and grow as much as they can. So an example would be taking an acorn and giving it the necessary skills it needs or appropriate supports in order to become a full-grown oak tree, that kind of thing. So Abraham Maslow was a humanistic psychologist and theorist. He was the oldest of 7 children, and he grew up in New York. He was Jewish, so he experienced a lot of ethnic prejudice. Abraham Maslow was a pretty interesting guy, and something that kind of, I would say, fueled his theoretical orientation and his development of the hierarchy of needs, which we'll discuss in a moment, was his relationship with his mother. So she was a very, very difficult woman. She had a lot of mental health issues. And Abraham Maslow was actually diagnosed as mentally unstable at one point, although this may be because of his mother, not quite sure. So an example of something his mother did was at one point when he was very young, he wanted to have a kitten, and she said no, so he was raising one in his basement. And his mother found it, picked up the kitten, and beat the kitten against a brick wall until it passed away. So this is kind of a small example of the relationship he had with his mother and what a difficult um, woman she was, and she was pretty cruel as well. And it makes sense, kind of looking back, if that's where he's coming from, and his interest in basic needs being met, in attachment theory, this kind of thing. And we'll talk a bit in the future about Harry Harlow and the monkey experiments, if you remember that from Psych 102. And Abraham Maslow was actually a research assistant when he was a student in that lab. So he worked quite a bit with attachment theory and that kind of thing. The story goes he developed his hierarchy of needs partially out of his relationship with his mother and all of the needs that she did not meet and did not help him to grow into his full potential. So the hierarchy of needs begins at the bottom and you kind of work your way up. Although, as we'll talk about in a moment, you don't have to meet each rung of the hierarchy in order to meet the next one. Overall, most healthy individuals are what we call basically satisfied with all of the rungs of the hierarchy. So the first one is physiological needs. And here we have water, food, sleep, sex, and breathing. And if you can think about it, it would be very difficult to really hone in on safety needs or especially like your self-esteem, that kind of thing, if you don't have somewhere to sleep, if you're not able to breathe, if you're not able to eat. Like those are very, very basic survival type needs. And all of your resources are going to go towards that if you're having major issues there. So that would be the most important rung of the hierarchy, I would say. Other things that go into this rung would be like homeostasis, your body kind of craving what it needs. Your book discusses in terms of appetite. So if you're low on levels of certain chemicals, that kind of thing, you may crave them. So wanting to kind of be balanced overall, which we'll talk about a lot throughout this quarter, our human desire for balance and homeostasis. So this exceeds all others in power. This one is the most important need that we all have to have as a foundation before we can move on to anywhere else, putting our resources towards anything else. So the second rung of the hierarchy is safety needs. So we feel that we've met our needs in terms of survival, we're eating, we have water, this kind of thing, we're able to breathe. Now we can move on to something that's also very important, but not quite as important as something as abstract as self-actualization, which we'll talk about later. So with safety needs, we have security of resources, employment, family, health, feeling that you're kind of taken care of, that you have a roof over your head, that you're not experiencing too much stress, which we discussed before in the chapter on stress. And another thing with safety needs that's come up more in the more recent years of history would be things like feeling that you have a savings account, that you have good insurance, good retirement, that kind of thing. So we've gotten kind of out of the more primal safety needs of survival and more into these kind of social constructed safety needs, like, am I getting paid well enough? Do I have a 401k? That kind of thing. And this could be a real issue for someone who's maybe high in neuroticism, which we'll talk about when we discuss personality. And neuroticism is one of the main personality traits of the big five, and that's kind of getting at emotional stability. So if you're someone who's already not very emotionally stable with your personality, you may struggle more with safety needs, while someone else may feel pretty safe in general. The third rung would be love and belonging. So if you think about it, it's kind of hard to really hone in your efforts on developing friendships and love and intimacy and affection if you can't breathe or you can't eat or drink, if you don't feel safe and you're trying to find somewhere to sleep for the night. So you can see how the needs at the foundation are much more important, and it's hard to put efforts towards anything else unless those are basically met. And then the fourth rung would be esteem needs. So with this one, we have independence, self-respect, confidence, and achievement. Once again, it makes sense. It would be very difficult to feel independent or confident if one had difficulties with their social aspects. And you can really see attachment theory here as well. The idea with attachment theory is that if you have a secure relationship with a primary caregiver, that trust, belonging, attachment, bonding, all of those things that a child would get from a caregiver in order to self-soothe, say, for instance, if they get hurt or something like that, or they are upset emotionally. Over time, attachment theory looks at it as we can eventually kind of instill those factors within ourselves and then self-soothe. So as an adult, if we have a setback or something negative happens to us emotionally, we can calm ourselves down. So it's difficult to do that, to have self-esteem, if we didn't have someone kind of model that for us as a child, or we don't have social support in order to feel good about ourselves. So you can see how the hierarchy is kind of narrowing down as we go up. And then the last rung of the hierarchy is self-actualization. So this one we have morality, problem solving, acceptance of facts, and creativity. So this is a very abstract kind of idea. And from your textbook, the definition is the realization of one's potential, what one is capable of, and this would be like the ultimate need. So new discontent and restlessness will soon develop unless the individual is doing what he is fitted for. So for example, we've met all of our needs basically overall, and now we hit this point in our lives where in your textbook it gives the example of an artist or a musician. If an artist or a musician has all of those needs taken care of, they're going to feel restless unless they're doing what they're they're supposed to do. They're finding meaning in their life, that kind of thing. So that could be a way of looking at self-actualization. However, some individuals believe that not everyone can become self-actualized. So some people believe that only individuals like Mother Teresa or Gandhi ever become self-actualized, and the rest of us may never meet that rung of the hierarchy. And this kind of just depends on the way you view the world. We all have different experiences and different ways of viewing this. As far as I know, there's no right or wrong answer. There's no correct answer to this question. It's just kind of the way you theoretically explain the hierarchy of needs. So some people say that only a few can be self-actualized. Some people say everyone can become self-actualized, and that's kind of up in the air. Like I said, there's a degree of fixity, so the hierarchy is not rigid. We may go up and down the rungs of the hierarchy throughout our lifetime. For example, an extreme example would be, you may be self-actualized or partially self-actualized, and then you experience a natural disaster or something like that, and you go back down to the foundational hierarchy of need with physiological needs, survival, that kind of thing. There's also a degree of relative satisfaction. So it's not an all or nothing type thing. Like I said, most of us are basically satisfied, and typically what you see is more satisfaction at the bottom and then less as you go up. For example, if I just gave arbitrary numbers, I could say I am about 90% satisfied with my physiological needs. I feel pretty good there. I'm about 75% satisfied with my safety needs. Maybe I feel like I could have a better savings account, and I'm kind of stressed out about that. I may feel about 60% satisfied with my love and belonging needs. Maybe I feel like I could have more friends or get closer to people I know. And then maybe I'm 40% satisfied with my esteem needs and 30% with self-actualization. So you see people become a little bit less satisfied as they go up, but overall satisfied to an extent, if that makes sense. And then we have multiple motivations of behavior. So it's not as black and white as saying me eating a meal is to satisfy my physiological needs. I might also be eating to satisfy my safety needs. By eating a big meal, I feel safe, I feel comfortable. I may be meeting a love and belonging need. So maybe comfort food makes me feel better and like I belong. Maybe it lifts up my self-esteem, something like that. So one behavior may have multiple motivators to it, and this would heavily depend on the individual and the circumstances. And then most normal people are partially satisfied and unsatisfied with all their basic needs at the same time, which makes sense, and we've kind of discussed that with that idea of relative satisfaction. Oh, and I do want to note that most all of these needs are more often unconscious than conscious. So they're kind of underlying the consciousness. We're not quite aware of what's going on, what's motivating our behaviors. So the next section looks at Albert Bandura, and we'll be discussing self-efficacy. So if Bandura sounds familiar to you, you probably discussed him in Psych 102 as well. So he's a very, very famous psychologist. He was the youngest child of 6 and the only son, born in Canada, and he actually stumbled upon psychology. So he was attending school for a different major and a different intended career path, and he had some free time in the morning, so he thought, well, I'll just sign up for this class that happens to be available. It was a psychology course, and he really enjoyed the topics, so he wound up going into the field. And he is what we would call a behavioral theorist. So while Abraham Maslow was humanistic, Albert Bandura would be more behavioral. And the idea here with behavioral theory is we're looking at observable behaviors as the main, I suppose you would say, motivator for what we do. Um, and he developed the social learning theory. And if you remember Bandura, you should probably associate him with the Bobo doll. So that may make more sense if those two sound like they go together. And we'll talk about his famous study with the Bobo doll, although he tweaked it many different times. But overall, there was a Bobo doll, and he was looking at modeling behavior, social learning theory. Would a child repeat specifically aggressive behaviors that an adult model was displaying by beating on a Bobo doll? If the child was left alone after watching the adult beat up a Bobo doll, would they repeat those behaviors? And would they learn from the social modeling that they observed? But we'll talk about that later in another section. So for today's topic, we're going to talk about Bandura in terms of self-efficacy. So there are two different terms I want you to know. There's outcome expectancy and self-efficacy or efficacy expectation. Those two terms can be used interchangeably. So outcome expectancy is an individual's estimate that a behavior will lead to specific outcomes. And self-efficacy or efficacy expectation is the belief that one can execute the behavior needed to produce outcomes. So one's sense of control. So for example, if you believe that listening to this lecture and studying and taking notes will result in receiving an A on your quiz, a high grade, that would be an outcome expectancy. You're expecting, you have an estimate that the behavior of taking notes and listening will lead to an A on your quiz. Okay. Self-efficacy is the belief that you can execute that behavior needed to produce that outcome. So you may believe that yes, listening to the lecture, taking notes will result in an A, but you may not have high enough self-efficacy to believe that you are capable of doing that. So you may feel that oh, I'm probably going to check out, I'll get bored, I'll get busy, I won't actually listen, I won't take good notes, that kind of thing. You could have very low self-efficacy and you don't feel that you'll be able to execute that behavior needed to get to the outcome expectancy. Or on the other hand, you could have very high self-efficacy and feel that you are very much capable of listening and taking notes and getting that A. So you can have one without the other. So here's a visual explanation of self-efficacy. So you have the individual, for instance, this could be you, your efficacy expectation or self-efficacy. So your sense of self-control, do you feel that you're capable of doing things, of having an effect on the outcomes of your environment, that kind of thing. And that may in turn lead to you either performing or not performing a behavior, for example, listening to this lecture. And that will lead to your outcome expectation that the behavior of listening to this lecture will lead to an A on your quiz, and that A would be the actual outcome. So the stronger an individual's self-efficacy, the more active effort they'll put forth, which makes sense. If you feel that you're very, very capable of being a good student and listening to lectures and attending classes and taking notes, it makes sense that you'd be more active or more likely to have an active effort to do those things. And on the other hand, if you have low self-efficacy and you don't feel that you're capable of doing those types of things, you're more likely to avoid them. So maybe not want to go to class, dread it, not enjoy it, that kind of stuff. Another thing is that self-efficacy is reinforced each time a goal is reached. So keeping this example, because it's easy, if you attend the lecture, take notes, and get an A, that may make you more likely to do that again because you feel that you're capable of doing it. Oh, it worked last time. So it's going to reinforce your goal of getting more and more A's, and maybe keep up your efforts and your ability to persist in trying. On the other hand, if you study and make an F on your quiz, you may not be as likely to continue trying. Your self-efficacy may decrease. And a lot of this stuff really makes sense if you think about it. It's just we don't really think about this stuff in our day-to-day life. And And with these types of lectures in this class, I'm putting terms to things that you may already kind of know in a way. So there are different things that affect initiation and persistence of coping behaviors. In particular, there are 3 dimensions of self-efficacy. So the first one is the magnitude. And like I said, self-efficacy is your expectation, right? Your efficacy expectation. So we have magnitude. Some behaviors or efforts may be more difficult than others. So some may be easy, some may be moderately easy, some may be hard, that kind of thing. And some people stop at easy. If it gets any harder than that, they're not going to put effort towards it. And that's going to affect their self-efficacy. The second one is generality. So this deals with kind of the mastery of a behavior. So there may be a very generalized sense of mastery or a very specific sense of mastery. So if I do really well on this quiz and I get an A, I think I'll do well on all the quizzes. My sense of mastery is going to generalize to every quiz in this course, or maybe generalize to all quizzes in all of my courses this quarter. Or is it going to be very specific? So my self-efficacy is only towards this specific quiz on this topic because I studied this topic really hard. And for the next one, it will be a whole different ball game, that kind of thing. And then the third is strength. So some behaviors require more perseverance, and some may be easily extinguishable. So trying, you don't get very hard, so you just kind of give up. Your efforts are extinguished. You stop trying, that kind of thing. Or you may keep persevering. And a big part of this is going to be your expectation of the result. So your expectation of your your self-control, that kind of thing. So all of this put together is going to determine how much effort one will expend and how long they will persist in the face of obstacles. The last part of efficacy, expectation, self-efficacy, is going to be the sources of efficacy expectations. So the book discusses that self-efficacy is based on 4 major sources of information. The first one is going to be performance accomplishments, which we've kind of discussed already, that idea of our self-efficacy being reinforced each time we achieve a goal. So if you perform well and you accomplish, say, getting an A on this quiz, that's going to build up your self-efficacy for the next quiz and the quiz after that and that kind of thing. The second one is vicarious experience. So this would be experience you're gaining through somebody else vicariously. So this could be someone modeling this for you. It could be a peer, maybe took the class last quarter and is telling you, oh yeah, the quizzes they aren't that difficult, you can do it, that kind of thing. So because they did it, you feel that you can. It could also be experience, I suppose, in you taking a quiz in another class maybe, and because you did well there, you feel that you will be able to kind of generalize that to this class. But overall, it's kind of experience through someone else's experience or a different experience. The third is verbal persuasion. So this is a big one, and this could be internal or it could be external. So that could mean, once again, a peer kind of building up your self-esteem by telling you you've got it, you can do this, it's not that difficult. It could be kind of left over from when you were a child or you're growing up, or even last week when you talked with your parent or caregiver, that kind of thing, and they made you feel really good about yourself. It could be from a professor telling you that you really seem to understand the content. So any type of verbal persuasion, and that would be more external, but we also have internal. So we all have this internal voice that kind of guides us, and it helps us to understand the world around us and navigate the world. And this could be, at times, a positive self-voice or even a negative self-voice. And a positive self-voice in particular will build up good positive self-efficacy. So that voice telling you, I've got this, I can do it, I've done it in the past. On the other hand, a negative self-voice saying, you don't have this, you're dumb, that kind of thing, that can really break down your self-efficacy. And once again, if you're coming at this from an attachment theorist perspective, the thought here would be that as a child, your caregiver You built a good, secure, trusting bond. They gave you that positive verbal persuasion, and then over time you instilled that within yourself, and you developed positive self-talk so that you could self-soothe, that kind of thing. And then the fourth source would be physiological states. So this is getting into like your sympathetic nervous system. So if you're the type of individual who, for one reason or another, gets really physically um, has physically heightened sensations when they experience stress or something like that. So let's say you're taking your quiz for this class. If you've got it, you understand the material, and yet your body's kind of working against you by having your heart rate go up, your breathing speed up, your brain get kind of cloudy, this heightened physiological state, that may mess a little bit with your self-efficacy, because then you may do poorly, and then the next time you go to take a quiz, your physiological state kind of works against you again and again and again. Or the other way around, you could feel calm, cool, and collected, and then that just kind of helps build your self-efficacy for the next time. You feel like, I've got this. I felt calm last time I took the quiz, that kind of thing. And then self-talk, which is kind of going back to that verbal persuasion. This would be self-regulation, emotion regulation, and increased self-efficacy if the self-talk is positive. So that's exactly what I was saying earlier with this idea of attachment theory. Having a positive inner voice, we all have inner voices, that's like our conscious, some people would call it. Um, we call it self-talk in general. So that leads to self-regulation, emotion regulation, and in turn, increased self-efficacy. So if you're able to instill a positive kind of internalized voice of, I've got this, I'm an intelligent person, that kind of thing, you're able to calm yourself down in an emotionally heightened moment. Maybe something bad's happened, you've gone through a breakup, or you've gotten a bad grade or something like that. You're able to use that internal voice to self-regulate your emotions. All of this stuff combined can lead to increased self-efficacy. So, do we think that the sources of self-efficacy improve efficacy expectations? Yes, they do. Specifically, um, verbal persuasion is the most beneficial when it comes to building efficacy expectations. And the more believable the source, the more likely we are to have a change in our efficacy expectations. So for example, if the source is someone who's prestigious, trustworthy, we feel that they may be an expert, they seem very assured in their verbal persuasion, we're more likely to take it to heart, and it's going to build up, or on the other hand, break down our self-efficacy. So if you think about that, an example would be, yes, having a peer build you up and tell you that you've got this, and you're very smart and you can get an A on your quiz, that helps a lot and it makes us feel good. But having a professor or a psychologist or someone really advanced in the field tell us that you've got this, and I can tell you understand the material and the concepts, and you'll be fine, it kind of means a bit more if you think about that example, and there are many other examples as well. But right there you can see how that would affect your efficacy expectations more so, that specific type of source. So like I mentioned earlier, we have intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. So intrinsic is when a person does a thing solely for the pleasure of the activity. So the activity is its own reward, basically. And remember that motivation is why people do what they do. So an intrinsic motivator would be you come to class, you listen to the lecture because you enjoy the material, you like learning, you want to soak it all up, and that's its own reward. On the other hand, we have extrinsic motivators as well, and this is when a person does something for an outside reward. So using that example, coming to class, listening to the lecture, not so much because you're internally driven to, because you want to learn, because you enjoy it, and it's its own reward. It's because the reward comes from something else, like the A that you get on the class, or keeping your scholarship, or avoiding a punishment like getting in trouble and not being able to play in the next sports game, that kind of thing. So you can see the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic. Okay. And this is Edward Deci, too, the psychologist. So Deci looked at, in particular, when does when does play become work? Um, so he discussed children specifically in terms of school to begin his chapter. So if you think about a child, this could be a child maybe you're exposed to right now, a niece, a nephew, a younger sibling, or if you even think back to yourself when you were a child. Um, Children are very curious. They're interested in everything around them. They're always exploring. Everything's new. They're always learning. And you can see that they enjoy it. They enjoy the curiosity and the newness of everything. So you see a lot of children loving to learn their ABCs and show you what they've learned, loving to read books, that kind of stuff, wanting their parents to read to them. But then eventually you see kind of a shift where or maybe you remember it yourself, experiencing a shift in which you no longer wanted to read, you no longer wanted to learn, you no longer enjoyed going to school, you kind of avoided it, tried to sleep in, tried to get out of going to school, that kind of thing. So, what Deci was interested in is what is going on, what causes that shift, what causes that change. And he believed that it was a shift from being intrinsically motivated, so wanting to do something because it's its own reward, to becoming extrinsically motivated. So kids having to go to school and learn in order to get a gold star or not get grounded or that kind of thing. So more external motivators, rewards, or avoiding punishment. Okay, so how do rewards and punishments affect motivation? We have the locus of causality, so perceive actions caused by internal or external forces. So this would be kind of our viewpoint of things, of behaviors or effects of our behaviors, that kind of thing. So we're perceiving our viewpoint that actions are caused by either internal or external forces. And once again, there's a really high importance of self-talk here. So if you think about self-talk, it's going to come into play more with intrinsic motivation, not so much extrinsic because that's outside of the self, right? And we talked about how positive self-talk is a big part of our efficacy, our self-efficacy, and we need self-efficacy because it goes hand in hand with internal motivation, which this will make more sense as I keep going. Another thing that Deci discussed is this idea of chaos. So I just talked about how his theory is that by moving from internal motivators to external motivators, we're losing our desire to learn, and play is becoming work, right? So, what would happen if we took away all external motivators? And he said specifically within the school system, like for kids, that kind of thing. So, what if there were no more rules, no more stars, no more punishments, no more having to study to take the test, that kind of thing? Well, he theorized that at first things would be chaotic, but over time, as humans, we like structure, we like organization, that kind of thing, especially children. Children crave structure. So he believed that over time, the chaos would kind of dissipate, and children in particular within the school system would develop their own structure, specifically in terms of internal motivation. So becoming more internally motivated again, going back to kind of how they were before they entered the school system and were forced into adhering to external motivators. So that was kind of his perfect world theory. We'll see if that ever happens, but we'll probably never have the opportunity type thing. Okay, so the last slide discusses Deci's the research study from the textbook. So just like many other studies that we've talked about, we will talk about, they there are many different versions that have been tweaked slightly to see different variables and different aspects of the theory in particular. So the first version of this study, he took a group of college students, once again, so that's convenient sampling, right? And he took half of them and he would put them in a room and ask them to complete a puzzle. that was actually pretty interesting. So an interesting puzzle. And then the part that he was really, really interested in, him and his team, was how would these students respond after the intervention? So what would they do once the intervention is finished, the study's done, and now you're left alone in the room? So that's what they were really watching. Like they had a camera set up, to see what would happen after the intervention. And the idea was that if a student continued to play with the puzzles after the intervention ended, that meant that they found them to be a reward in themselves. So they were intrinsically motivated to complete the puzzles. If the students did not touch the puzzles after the intervention, uh, they weren't intrinsically motivated, they were extrinsically motivated, and that meant that their desire to play with the puzzles would go down, so they wouldn't want to. So with the first version, he had half of the students get paid each time they completed a puzzle correctly. And there were 4 puzzles per version, so that could be a total of $4. So half paid for each correct puzzle, the other half was the control group, so they didn't get paid at all, they just completed the puzzles, that's it. So, like I said, this is the part that they're interested in after the intervention. So when they're left alone with the puzzles, given a break, what are they going to do? And he found that the students in the intervention group, the ones that were paid, their intrinsic motivation went down. So they didn't really play with the puzzles that were left in the break room. They maybe read a magazine, that kind of thing. They weren't intrinsically motivated. They were extrinsically motivated by the money, right? The second version, half of the participants in the intervention group heard an obnoxious buzzer when they answered incorrectly. So they were punished as opposed to rewarded. But once again, there's an external factor going on, right? That punishment of the buzzer. And the other half, again, control group, experienced no buzzer. And we were comparing the two. So here, during the break, the group that was in the intervention, hearing the buzzer, they also did not play with the puzzles any more than the control group. Actually, they played with them less. So their intrinsic motivation also went down because they were basing their behaviors on avoiding the punishment, which would be an external motivator, right? So intrinsic motivation went down. With the third version, half the participants were control, the other half were paid for each puzzle regardless of whether it was right or wrong. So their payment was not contingent upon their performance. And during the break, these participants played with the puzzles equally as much as the control group. So it really had no effect on their performance, their internal versus external motivation, right? The fourth version, half were given positive feedback, like, oh, you did a good job, or head nods, saying right, that kind of thing. And this group, this is where it starts to get interesting. During the break, their intrinsic motivation went up as compared to the control group. So they actually played with the puzzles even more than the members of the control group. So positive feedback is really important to increase our internal motivation and make us want to do something more. The fifth version, half were paid money and given positive feedback. This is also interesting. So what we saw here was they played with the puzzles equally as much as the control group. So being paid, which in itself will decrease your intrinsic motivation because you're working towards an external reward, and being given positive feedback, which we see increases internal motivation, those two kind of cancel each other out, if that makes sense. And then the sixth version, half were given negative feedback compared to the control group, which received nothing. And with this group, this intervention group, they failed miserably at the puzzles, and their intrinsic motivation went way down afterwards, so they did not play with the puzzles at all during the break. So this was like worst case scenario. All intrinsic motivation was stripped away, and they just did not do well at all. So you can see once again how we discussed how verbal persuasion is so important for self-efficacy, and negative verbal persuasion can be detrimental. So their self-efficacy went down, they performed poorly, and their intrinsic motivation went down as a result. Okay, so a couple of just little tidbits from the end of this chapter was Deci discussed how ideally work would pay employees with a straight salary that's not tied to reward, because as we saw with his study, those who were paid for their correct puzzles, their internal motivation went down, and those that were paid just a flat rate, it was pretty equal, so it didn't harm intrinsic motivation, which in turn would affect productivity, um, self-efficacy, enjoyment of job, that kind of thing. And then the other thing is that positive feedback is the best thing we can do. Um, so if you're thinking about maybe a child, that kind of thing within the school system, the best thing to build self-efficacy and intrinsic motivation would be to give positive feedback, and the worst thing would be negative feedback, right? So if you have any questions about this section, you can feel free to post it on the forum. It should be on Moodle right under this link. And then we'll also do a quick check-in and recap of this information when we meet for class on Tuesday. And you can also always email me if you have any other questions.